Western Germany, February 6, 1944, 1300 hours, and Oberleutnant Hans Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11 tightened his grip on the control stick of his Focke-Wulf F W 190A6, watching the massive formation of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses approaching from the west at 23,000 feet, their contrails stretching across the winter sky like white scars, when something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. A glint of metal beneath the nose of the lead bomber where no guns should have been, twin barrels protruding from what looked like a powered turret mounted directly under the bombardier's position. And in that instant Knoke realized everything Jagdgeschwader 2's Egon Mayer had taught them about attacking the amerikanische Viermots from head-on. The tactic that had brought down hundreds of flying fortresses since November 1942 might suddenly be worthless, obsolete, a death trap for any German fighter pilot foolish enough to attempt it. The Luftwaffe's discovery of the B-17's frontal vulnerability had been almost accidental, born from desperation and the brilliant tactical mind of Hauptmann Egon Mayer, commander of 3. Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, who on November 23, 1942, had led his Focke-Wulf F W 190s against a formation of amerikanische heavy bombers over France, experimenting with an approach that contradicted everything German fighter doctrine had taught about attacking bombers, coming in fast and level from 12 o'clock high, the most dangerous angle imaginable with a closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour, giving the pilot perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before braking. A way to avoid collision, yet Mayer had noticed something the technical intelligence officers at Rechlin had missed, that the early model B-17E and B-17F Flying Fortresses had minimal forward defensive armament. Just 2 flexible 50 caliber machine guns operated by the navigator and bombardier through cheek windows, plus whatever the top turret could depress forward, which wasn't much, leaving a cone of vulnerability directly in front of the bomber that no amount of armor plating could protect. Mayer had practiced the attack meticulously with his wingman, George Peter Eder of Jagdgeschwader 2, developing what they called the frontal Angriff or head-on attack, approaching in a ket formation of 3 aircraft flying in a shallow V, aiming for a point just ahead of the bomber's nose to account for the deflection, opening fire with their 220mm MG-151-20 cannons and 213mm MG-131 machine guns at maximum range of 800 meters, walking the tracers through the cockpit area as they closed, then braking hard left or right at the last possible second, pulling 6 or 7 GS to avoid ramming the bomber, a maneuver that required exceptional flying skills and steel nerves, because any hesitation, any slight miscalculation, meant certain death in a head-on collision at a combined speed that could exceed 700 miles per hour. The results had been devastating for the American 8th Air Force, as German fighter pilots across the Western Front adopted Mayer's tactics with deadly efficiency, and by early 1943, every Jagdgeschwader from Norway to the Bay of Biscay was training its pilots in the frontal attack, with detailed diagrams distributed showing the B-17's blind spots, the optimal approach angles, the precise aiming points to hit the flight deck where the pilot and co-pilot sat behind nothing more than standard aircraft. Aluminum and some sheets of armor plate that might stop machine gun rounds but were useless against 20mm cannon shells, and the statistics bore out the effectiveness of the new tactics, with American bomber losses climbing steadily through the spring and summer of 1943, reaching catastrophic levels during the deep penetration raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. August 17, 1943, had been a day of triumph for the Jagdwaffe, as 300 German fighters had torn into the American bomber streams heading for the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, with pilots from Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 3, Jagdgeschwader 11, Jagdgeschwader 26, and Jagdgeschwader 27 executing perfectly coordinated frontal attacks, the FW-190s and BF-109s approaching in waves, each staffel taking its turn, maintaining pressure on the bomber formations from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast until they reached their targets, and the American losses had been staggering, 60 B-17s shot down in a single day, with most falling victim to the head on attacks that shattered their cockpits, killed or wounded the pilots, and sent the massive bombers spiraling down out of control, trailing fire and smoke as they fell from 25,000 feet. The technique had become so successful that Luftwaffe training schools were teaching it as standard doctrine, with new pilots spending hours studying gun camera footage from successful attacks, learning to judge the precise moment to open fire, the exact deflection needed to put their rounds through the bomber's nose, the split-second timing required to break away before collision, and veterans like Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz, Galland of Jagdgeschwader 26, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland were refining the tactics even further, experimenting with different approach angles, varying the size of attacking formations, coordinating multiple staffline to hit the bombers simultaneously from different clock positions, overwhelming the defensive fire of the formation. The Americans had tried various countermeasures, tightening their combat box formations to concentrate defensive fire, staggering altitude between groups to make it harder for fighters to line up attacks, adding more ammunition for the top turret gunner, installing additional armor plating around the cockpit area, but nothing seemed to stop the devastating frontal attacks that were bleeding the 8th Air Force white, and by October 1943, after the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th that the Americans would later call Black Thursday, when 60 more B-17s were shot down and another 138 damaged, many by frontal attacks, the American strategic bombing campaign had effectively ground to a halt, with deep penetration raids into Germany suspended until long-range escort fighters could be deployed. Japanese Army Air Force Captain Yoshio Yoshida, commanding officer of the 244th Sentai based at Chofu Airfield near Tokyo, had studied the German reports on anti-bomber tactics with intense interest through the military attaché in Berlin, recognizing that Japan would soon face similar challenges when the new American B-29 superfortresses began appearing over the home islands, and the Japanese had already discovered through bitter experience in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea that the B-17 was a formidable opponent, heavily armed and extremely difficult to shoot down even with concentrated attacks, requiring multiple hits from 20mm cannon to bring down, and Yoshida knew that the B-29 would be even more dangerous, with remote-controlled turrets, pressurized crew compartments, and performance that would put it above the operational ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. The Japanese approach to bomber interception had evolved differently from the German methods, partly due to the different aircraft available and partly due to the Bushido warrior code that influenced Japanese military thinking, leading to tactics that emphasize close-in attacks, ramming when necessary, with pilots of the Shinden Saikutai units specifically trained for deliberate collision attacks against B-29s, though these TACO or special attack missions were intended to be survivable, with the pilot ramming his fighter's reinforced wing root into the bomber's tail or engine, then bailing out if possible, a technique that required extraordinary courage and precise flying skills, though the loss rate among Japanese pilots attempting such attacks was predictably high. Italian Regia Aeronautica Major Adriano Visconti, commanding the 1 Squadriglia of the 1 Degree Gruppo Caccia, had encountered American heavy bombers for the first time in early 1943 when B-17s of the 12th Air Force began attacking Italian airfields and ports from bases in North Africa, and Visconti, flying his Macchi C-202 Folgore, had quickly learned that the American bombers were far more dangerous than the British Wellingtons and Blenheims the Italians had faced in the Mediterranean, with heavier defensive armament, better armor protection, and the ability to maintain formation even after taking severe damage, characteristics that made them extremely difficult targets for Italian fighters that were already struggling with fuel shortages, lack of spare parts, and pilots exhausted from 3 years of continuous combat. The Italians had attempted to adapt German tactics, with Visconti personally leading frontal attacks against B-17 formations, but the Macchi C-202, despite being one of Italy's best fighters, lacked the heavy armament needed to guarantee kills on the rugged American bombers, carrying only two 12.7mm Breda Safet machine guns in the nose and two 7.7mm guns in the wings, weapons that were barely adequate against fighters and completely insufficient against for engine bombers, forcing Italian pilots to make multiple passes, expending precious ammunition and fuel while exposed to concentrated defensive fire from the B-17 formations, and the results had been predictably poor, with few bombers shot down and heavy losses among the attacking fighters. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, Japanese Navy Lieutenant Commander Sadaki Akamatsu of the 302nd Kokutai based at Atsugi had been developing his own anti-bomber tactics, studying after-action reports from pilots who had engaged B-17s over Rabaul and the Solomon Islands, noting that the American bombers seemed most vulnerable when attacked from below and behind, where the ball turret's field of fire was restricted and the tail gunner couldn't depress his weapons enough to engage fighters in a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low position, but even these attacks required exceptional flying skills and precise timing, as the bomber's defensive fire was still formidable, and many Japanese pilots had been shot down attempting to close within effective cannon range. Back in Western Europe, the Luftwaffe's confidence in their frontal attack tactics had reached its zenith in late 1943, with experienced pilots like Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, who had personally shot down 12 B-17s using Meyer's head-on technique, teaching younger pilots the finer points of the attack, the importance of maintaining speed throughout the approach to minimize exposure to defensive fire, the need to aim slightly high to account for bullet drop at longer ranges. The critical timing of the breakaway maneuver that had to be initiated before the natural instinct for self-preservation kicked in, because waiting even a fraction of a second too long meant certain death in a collision that would destroy both aircraft. The Germans had also been experimenting with heavier armament specifically designed for bomber destruction, with some FW-190s carrying additional 20mm or even 30mm cannon in underwing gondolas, though these installations degraded the fighter's performance and made it vulnerable to American escort fighters when they appeared, leading to the development of specialized bomber-destroyer units like Sturmstaffel 1, created in late 1943, equipped with heavily armed and armored FW-190s specifically designed for close-in attacks on bomber formations, accepting reduced maneuverability in exchange for the firepower and protection needed to press home attacks through defensive fire. The technical intelligence officers at the Luftwaffe Test Center at Rechlin had been continuously analyzing captured B-17s, including intact examples that had landed in German-controlled territory due to battle damage or navigation errors, studying every aspect of the bomber's construction, armament, and armor protection, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited, and their reports had consistently confirmed what Egon Mayer had discovered through practical experience, that the B-17F's forward hemisphere was its most vulnerable area, with limited fields of fire for defensive weapons and critical systems like the flight controls, engines, and crew positions relatively exposed to frontal attack. German pilots had become so proficient at the frontal attack that some were achieving remarkable success rates, with aces like Hauptmann Hugo Frey of Jagdgeschwader 11 developing personal techniques that improved on Meyer's original concept, approaching from slightly below the bomber's nose to avoid detection until the last moment, using the bomber's own blind spot created by the nose structure to mask their approach, then pulling up sharply in the final seconds to rake the cockpit and nose compartment with cannon fire before breaking away, a variation that required exceptional timing but reduced exposure to defensive fire from the formation. The psychological impact of the frontal attacks on American bomber crews had been profound, with many aircraft commanders reporting that watching German fighters approaching head-on at combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, growing from specs to full-sized aircraft in seconds, knowing that both machines were committed to collision courses that would end in either a successful attack or mutual destruction, was the most terrifying experience of combat, far worse than flak or attacks from other angles where at least the gunners could return fire effectively, and this psychological warfare aspect hadn't been lost on the Germans, who recognized that shaking bomber crew morale was almost as valuable as actually shooting down aircraft. The Americans had been desperately seeking solutions to the frontal attack problem throughout 1943, with various field modifications attempted by bomb groups in England, including mounting additional 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, cutting gun ports in the plexiglass nose cone, even mounting a single gun on a pintle mount that the bombardier could fire forward, but these expedient measures had proven largely ineffective, lacking the field of fire and firepower needed to deter determined frontal attacks, and the losses had continued to mount through the summer and fall of 1943, reaching levels that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. Unknown to the Germans, however, the Americans had been working on a more comprehensive solution since early 1943, when the YB-40 escort fighter project, essentially a B-17 converted into a heavily armed gunship, had tested various defensive armament configurations, including a powered chin turret designed and manufactured by Bendix Aviation Corporation of South Bend, Indiana, and while the YB-40 itself had proven unsuccessful, too heavy and slow to keep up with standard bombers after they dropped their bomb loads, the Bendix chin turret had shown remarkable promise, offering 250 caliber machine guns in a powered mount that could traverse 120 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically, controlled remotely by the bombardier through a sophisticated sight system. The decision to incorporate the Bendix chin turret into production B-17s had been made in mid-1943, with the first installations appearing on late production B-17F models built by Douglas Aircraft Company at Long Beach, California, starting with the B-17F-70DL production block, approximately 65 to 86 aircraft depending on sources, but the real change had come with the introduction of the B-17G model, which incorporated the chin turret as standard equipment from the beginning of production in July 1943, along with other defensive improvements including staggered waist gun positions to give gunners more room, an improved tail gun position called the Cheyenne turret, with a wider field of fire, and additional armor protection for crew positions. Boeing's Seattle factory had begun B-17G production in July 1943, followed by Douglas at Long Beach and Lockheed Vega at Burbank, with all three production lines incorporating the Bendix chin turret and other defensive improvements, and by September 1943, the first B-17GS were arriving in England, initially in small numbers as production ramped up, supplementing the older B-17E and F models that still comprised the bulk of 8th Air Force's heavy bomber strength. But the impact of even a few chin turret-equipped bombers in a formation was immediate and dramatic, as German fighter pilots suddenly found their favored attack approach had become lethal. The first German pilots to encounter the chin turret had been shocked by the sudden increase in forward firepower, with 2 additional 50-caliber machine guns firing at them during their approach, controlled by a bombardier who had nothing else to do during the fighter attacks except track targets and fire, unlike the navigator who had been responsible for the cheek guns while also trying to maintain course calculations and position plots, and the powered traverse of the chin turret meant it could track fast-moving fighters throughout their approach, maintaining fire even as they broke away, filling the air with tracer rounds that made the frontal attack suddenly far more dangerous than it had ever been. Oberleutnant Hans Knoke had been leading a swarm of 4 FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 11 on December 20, 1943, when he first encountered B-17GS with chin turrets, approaching a formation of mixed B-17F and G models over Bremen, lining up for his typical frontal attack approach that had served him well in shooting down a dozen flying fortresses, when suddenly the nose of the lead bomber erupted in muzzle flashes. Not the sporadic fire of hand-held guns, but the steady, concentrated stream of a powered turret, and Knoke had instinctively broken away early, aborting his attack run, watching in horror as his wingman, Unteroffizier Fritz Müller, pressed his attack and flew directly into the concentrated fire of multiple chin turrets, his FW-190 disintegrating under the impact of dozens of 50-caliber rounds. The news of the chin turret spread quickly through Luftwaffe fighter units, with pilots returning from missions reporting that the Americans had somehow solved their frontal vulnerability problem, that approaching B-17s from 12 o'clock high was now suicidal, that the new turrets could put out a volume of fire that made it impossible to maintain a steady approach long enough to aim properly, forcing pilots to break away early or risk destruction, and the kill rates for frontal attacks dropped dramatically from the 20 to 30% success rates of mid-1943 to less than 5% by early 1944, a change that effectively eliminated the Luftwaffe's most successful anti-bomber tactic. German fighter commanders were forced to rapidly adapt their tactics, shifting back to attacks from the rear quarters, diving attacks from above, climbing attacks from below, any approach angle except the frontal attack that had been their most effective weapon. But these alternative approaches had their own problems, exposing attackers to the concentrated fire of the tail guns, top turret, ball turret, and waist guns, requiring longer exposure times to achieve hits, and the psychological advantage of the head-on attack, that terrifying sense of imminent collision that shook bomber crew morale, was lost when fighters reverted to more conventional attack patterns. The Japanese had been monitoring German tactical developments through their embassy in Berlin and military attaches attached to Luftwaffe units, and Captain Yoshio Yoshida had received detailed reports about the American chin turret development, recognizing that the B-29 superfortresses that would soon appear over Japan would likely have similar or even more advanced defensive systems, and indeed, when the first B-29s appeared over Kyushu in June 1944, they carried not only remote controlled turrets but a sophisticated fire control system that could link multiple turrets under the control of a single gunner, making frontal attacks even more suicidal than against the chin turret-equipped B-17GS. Major Adriano Visconti of the Regia Aeronautica had less opportunity to observe the impact of chin turrets, as Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, just as the first B-17GS were entering combat, but those Italian pilots who continued fighting with the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana of Mussolini's Italian Social Republic in northern Italy reported that the American bombers had become even more dangerous, with increased forward firepower that made the already difficult frontal attacks practically impossible for Italian fighters that lacked the heavy armament and armor protection of German fighters. The technical experts at Rechlin had attempted to develop countermeasures to the chin turret, experimenting with standoff weapons like the Werfer Granit 21 rocket mortar, essentially a modified infantry rocket launcher mounted under the wing of fighters, firing a 21-centimeter rocket with a 40-pound warhead that could theoretically be launched from outside the range of defensive machine guns, But the weapon proved inaccurate and difficult to aim, with most rockets missing their targets entirely, and the drag and weight of the launcher tubes severely degraded fighter performance, making the aircraft vulnerable to American escort fighters. Another approach had been to increase armor protection on fighters specifically designated for bomber attacks, leading to the development of the Sturmbach or battering ram versions of the FW-190, with additional armor plating around the engine and cockpit, heavier armament including 30mm 108 Malawian Quachas cannons, and bulletproof glass windscreens thick enough to stop 50 caliber rounds. But these modifications added so much weight that the fighters could barely keep up with the bombers, and they were sitting ducks for American P-51 Mustang escorts that began appearing in increasing numbers through early 1944. The Germans also experimented with new attack formations, trying to overwhelm the defensive fire through mass attacks, with entire Gruppen of 30 or 40 fighters attacking simultaneously from multiple angles, hoping that sheer numbers would allow some aircraft to get through the defensive fire. But coordinating such attacks proved difficult in the chaos of air combat, and the concentration of fighters in one area made them vulnerable to American escort fighters, leading to what the Germans called Gross Luftschlacht, or Great Air Battles, where hundreds of aircraft maneuvered in relatively small volumes of airspace. By February 1944, when American bombers resumed deep penetration raids into Germany during Big Week, the Luftwaffe fighter force was in crisis, having lost its most effective anti-bomber tactic to the chin turret, forced to resort to increasingly desperate measures including ramming attacks similar to those used by the Japanese, with pilots of special Sturmstaffel units taking an oath to press home their attacks regardless of defensive fire, even if it meant deliberate collision with the bomber. Though unlike the Japanese Taco attacks, German pilots were expected to bail out and survive if possible. Major Egon Mayer himself, the architect of the frontal attack tactic, had been forced to acknowledge that his technique was no longer viable against chin turret-equipped B-17GS, writing in a report to Jagdgeschwader II headquarters in February 1944 that the addition of the forward ventral turret has made frontal attacks prohibitively dangerous, with loss rates among attacking fighters exceeding 40%, an unsustainable level that will destroy our fighter force faster than we can train. Replacements. A stunning admission from the man whose tactical innovation had terrorized American bomber crews for more than a year. The irony was that Mayer himself would be killed just weeks later on March 2, 1944, shot down by American P-47 Thunderbolt escort fighters while leading an attack on B-17 formations near Montmedy, France, no longer able to use his preferred frontal attack approach, forced instead into a beam attack that exposed him to both bomber defensive fire and escort fighter intervention, a death that symbolized the end of an era in aerial combat, the final proof that the chin turret had indeed ended the devastating head-on attacks that had been the Luftwaffe's deadliest weapon. Japanese Naval Aviation Lieutenant Commander Yasuhiro Shigematsu of the 252nd Kokutai, studying combat reports from the European theater while preparing to defend against B-29 raids, noted with concern that the Americans seemed to have an unlimited capacity for innovation, constantly improving their aircraft with new defensive systems, better armor, more powerful engines, and most importantly, learning from their losses to eliminate vulnerabilities, a process of continuous improvement that stood in stark contrast to Japanese aircraft development, which was hampered by resource shortages, industrial limitations, and an institutional resistance to change that left Japanese fighters increasingly outmatched. The impact of the chin turret extended beyond just tactical considerations, affecting German strategy at the highest levels, as Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was forced to acknowledge that the defensive fighter force was no longer capable of preventing American bombers from reaching their targets, leading to a shift in resources toward flak defenses, underground production facilities, and desperate wonder weapon projects like jet fighters and rocket interceptors, while the conventional fighter force that had once ruled European skies was ground down in increasingly futile attempts to stop the growing bomber streams. German ace Hauptmann Friedrich Karl Tutti Müller of Jagdgeschwader III, who had shot down 23 four-engine bombers by early 1944, described the psychological impact of the chin turret on German fighter pilots, saying that approaching a B-17G formation from the front was like flying into the mouth of a dragon-breathing fire, with the combined firepower of multiple chin turrets creating a wall of tracer fire that no amount of courage or skill could penetrate, forcing even the most experienced pilots to seek alternative attack angles that were inherently less effective and more dangerous. The production statistics told the story of American industrial might, with Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega ultimately producing 8,680 B-17 GS, each equipped with the Bendix chin turret, compared to only about 2,000 B-17 FS produced earlier, meaning that by mid-1944, the vast majority of American heavy bombers in Europe carried the defensive improvement that had neutralized the Luftwaffe's best tactic, a remarkable example of rapid adaptation to enemy tactics through industrial mass production. Italian fighter pilot Sergeant Maggiore Attilio Sanson, flying with the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana's 2 degrees Gruppo Caccia GG-3 Osse, in defense of northern Italian industrial targets, encountered B-17 GS of the 15th Air Force based in southern Italy during early 1944, and reported that the American bombers had become essentially impossible to attack successfully with Italian fighters, which lacked both the performance to catch the high-flying bombers and the firepower to damage them significantly even if they could get within range, leading to an effective abandonment of anti-bomber operations by Italian units. The Japanese Army Air Force's experience with attacking B-29s, which began in earnest in late 1944, proved even more frustrating than German encounters with chin turret-equipped B-17s, as the superfortresses not only had remote-controlled turrets with computer-assisted aiming but flew at altitudes above 30,000 feet where most Japanese fighters struggled to operate, and at speeds that made interception difficult even for the fastest Japanese aircraft, forcing Japanese pilots to resort to increasingly desperate tactics including mass ramming attacks that achieved little while costing irreplaceable pilots. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded defeat in daylight fighter versus bomber combat, with General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland admitting to his staff that the combination of improved bomber defenses, particularly the chin turret and long-range escort fighters, had made daylight interception operations prohibitively expensive in terms of pilot losses, leading to a strategic decision to conserve fighter strength for the anticipated Allied invasion of France rather than continuing to throw away fighters and pilots in futile attempts to stop the bomber offensive. The chin turret's success had implications beyond just the B-17 program, influencing American bomber design philosophy for the remainder of the war and into the jet age, with subsequent designs like the B-29 Superfortress and B-32 Dominator incorporating powered defensive turrets from the outset, learning the lesson that adequate defensive armament was essential for daylight bombing operations, even as newer technologies like jet engines and guided missiles would eventually make gun turrets obsolete in the post-war era. German pilots who survived the war later reflected on the chin turret as a turning point in the air war over Europe, with Oberleutnant Hans Knoke writing in his memoirs that the appearance of the chin turret marked the end of our ability to inflict serious losses on American bomber formations, forcing us into increasingly desperate and costly tactics that bled our fighter force white while achieving minimal results, a verdict echoed by many Luftwaffe veterans who saw the winter of 1943-44 as the period when they lost air superiority over their own territory. The technical details of the Bendix chin turret revealed American engineering prowess, with the turret weighing approximately 400 pounds including ammunition, powered by electric motors that could traverse the guns at 45 degrees per second, fast enough to track fighters through their attack runs, fed by ammunition boxes containing 365 rounds per gun, enough for about 30 seconds of continuous fire, and equipped with a K7 computing site that automatically calculated deflection based on target speed and angle, making it far more accurate than handheld guns. Japanese Navy Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and later commander of the 343rd Kokutai, studied American defensive armament evolution with professional interest, noting that the Americans had solved in months a problem that had plagued all air forces since the beginning of strategic bombing: how to adequately defend slow bombers against fast fighters, and the solution, powered turrets with computing sites and heavy-caliber weapons, represented a level of technological sophistication that Japan could not match with its limited industrial resources. The psychological warfare aspect of the chin turret extended to German propaganda, which initially tried to downplay its effectiveness, with Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels directing German media to describe the chin turret as another example of American over-engineering that adds weight and complexity without significantly improving combat effectiveness. But frontline pilots knew better, and morale in fighter units declined noticeably as pilots realized their most effective tactic had been countered, leading to increased requests for transfer to other duties and a general sense that the air war was being lost. American bomber crews, conversely, experienced a significant boost in morale with the introduction of the chin turret, with bombardiers particularly appreciating having offensive capability during fighter attacks rather than being passive victims, and crew reports from late 1943 and early 1944 consistently mentioned the psychological comfort of seeing German fighters break away early from frontal attacks, aborting their runs when faced with the streaming tracers from chin turrets, a complete reversal from the terrifying head-on attacks that had characterized the missions of mid-1943. The Luftwaffe's attempts to adapt to the chin turret included tactical innovations like the Gefechtsverband or battle formation, a mixed force of heavily armed and armored Sturmbach fighters escorted by lighter fighters to protect them from American escorts, approaching bomber formations from the rear in concentrated waves, accepting heavy losses to get close enough for their 30mm cannons to be effective, but these tactics required precise coordination and timing that often broke down in the chaos of combat, especially when American escort fighters intervened. Italian Social Republic ace Maggiore Adriano Visconti, who had assumed command of the 1-degree Gruppo Caccia after Italy's division, made one of the last recorded frontal attacks on B-17GS by an Italian pilot on March 16, 1944, diving through intense fire from multiple chin turrets to attack a straggling bomber near Milan, managing to damage the aircraft but taking numerous hits that forced him to bail out, later commenting that it had been absolute madness to attempt a frontal attack against the new American bombers and that he had only survived through luck. The Germans also experimented with psychological tactics to counter the effectiveness of the chin turret, instructing pilots to make feint attacks from the front to force gunners to expend ammunition, then breaking away before entering effective range, hoping to exhaust the ammunition supplies of the chin turrets before making actual attacks from other angles, but this tactic required precise timing and coordination that proved difficult to achieve in combat conditions, and American gunners quickly learned to conserve ammunition by firing only when fighters pressed their attacks. Production of the Bendix chin turret at the company's South Bend, Indiana facility reached peak efficiency by early 1944, with the unit cost dropping from initial estimates of over $5,000 per turret to less than $3,000 through mass production techniques, allowing the Americans to equip not only new production B-17GS, but also retrofit some older B-17FS with field modification kits, though the retrofit process was complex and required depot-level maintenance facilities, limiting the number of older aircraft that could be upgraded. The impact on German pilot training was equally significant, as instructors at fighter schools had to completely revise their curriculum, abandoning the frontal attack techniques that had been taught as standard doctrine for over a year, retraining experienced pilots in alternative tactics while trying to prepare new pilots for a form of combat that was becoming increasingly one-sided, with American bombers growing stronger while German fighters remained essentially unchanged except for heavier armament that degraded their performance. Japanese Army Air Force Major Toru Shinomiya, commanding the 244th Sentai's Interception Squadron, developed what he called shadow tactics for attacking B-29s, using cloud cover and the sun to mask approaches, attacking from angles where the bomber's remote-controlled turrets had limited fields of fire, but even these sophisticated tactics achieved limited success against the heavily armed and high-flying superfortresses, and Shinomiya himself was killed in December 1944 attempting to ram a B-29 after his ammunition was exhausted, a futile gesture that symbolized Japanese desperation. The strategic implications of the chin turret extended to the highest levels of German military planning, with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arguing in early 1944 that the Luftwaffe's inability to stop American bombers meant that the planned Atlantic Wall defenses would be subjected to devastating preparatory bombardment before any invasion, making static defense problematic, an assessment that proved prophetic when Allied bombers effectively neutralized German coastal defenses before D-Day, through concentrated bombing attacks that the Luftwaffe could not prevent. By March 1944, the transformation was complete, with Luftwaffe fighter units reporting that frontal attacks on B-17G formations were no longer viable under any circumstances, that the combination of chin turrets improved top turret depression, and cheek guns created an impenetrable cone of fire extending forward from each bomber, multiplied by the dozens of aircraft in each combat box formation, creating overlapping fields of fire that no fighter could survive, forcing German pilots to accept that their most successful tactic had been permanently countered. The final proof of the chin turret's effectiveness came during Big Week in February 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched massive raids against German aircraft production facilities, with B-17G formations penetrating deep into Germany with acceptable losses despite determined Luftwaffe opposition, the Chin turrets helping to break up coordinated fighter attacks and forcing German pilots into piecemeal efforts that American escort fighters could more easily counter, resulting in a favorable loss ratio that allowed the bombing campaign to continue and intensify. Luftwaffe General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland would later write in his memoirs that the introduction of the Chin turret was one of 3 decisive factors that turned the air war against Germany, along with the deployment of long-range escort fighters and the overwhelming American numerical superiority, stating that the Chin turret ended our ability to inflict prohibitive losses on unescorted bomber formations, forcing us into a defensive posture from which we never recovered. A remarkable admission from one of Germany's most successful fighter commanders. The Japanese experience paralleled the German frustration, with Captain Yoshio Yoshida reporting to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo that American defensive armament had evolved to the point where conventional interception tactics were no longer effective, that the B-29's defensive systems were like trying to attack a flying fortress that can see in all directions and shoot with superhuman accuracy, leading to the adoption of night fighter tactics and ultimately the desperate kamikaze attacks that characterized the final phase of the Pacific Air War. Italian fighter pilot Tenente Giulio Torrisi, flying a Macchi C-205 Veltro with the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, made one of the last recorded interception attempts against B-17GS by Italian forces on April 20, 1944, describing how his entire squadron was driven off by defensive fire before getting within effective cannon range, with 2 aircraft shot down by Chin turret fire and another damaged by tail gunners, convincing Italian commanders that further anti-bomber operations were futile, leading to a redeployment of remaining fighter units to ground attack missions. The cost-effectiveness of the Chin turret was remarkable when compared to other defensive measures, with each Bendix turret costing approximately $3,000 in mass production while potentially saving aircraft worth $238,000 and trained crews that were essentially irreplaceable, a return on investment that validated the American approach of using technology and industrial capacity to solve tactical problems, in stark contrast to the German and Japanese reliance on pilot skill and courage that could not be mass-produced. By April 1944, German intelligence estimates credited the Chin turret with reducing the effectiveness of fighter attacks on B-17 formations by 60%, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit larger numbers of fighters to achieve the same results as before, accelerating the attrition of the German fighter force at a time when pilot training was already failing to keep pace with losses, creating a death spiral that would see the Luftwaffe essentially cease to exist as an effective force by early 1945. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was equally significant, as the inability to stop American daylight bombing raids despite the presence of hundreds of fighters became obvious to anyone who looked up at the sky, watching the condensation trails of B-17 formations proceeding unmolested to their targets while German fighters milled about ineffectively, unable to penetrate the defensive fire, a visible symbol of German impotence that undermined propaganda claims about wonder, weapons, and final victory. American production statistics revealed the industrial might behind the Chin turret's success, with Bendix Aviation Corporation producing over 10,000 Chin turret units between 1943 and 1945, not only for B-17GS but also for other aircraft types, demonstrating the American ability to identify a tactical problem, develop a technical solution, and then mass-produce that solution in quantities that overwhelmed enemy countermeasures, a pattern that would characterize American military technology. Throughout the war, the last recorded successful frontal attack on a Chin turret-equipped B-17G by a German fighter was claimed by Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke of Jagdgeschwader 301 on March 6, 1944, who managed to shoot down a straggling bomber near Frankfurt by approaching from slightly below the Chin turret's minimum depression angle, firing a long burst from his FW-190's 420mm cannons into the bomber's nose before breaking away. But Reschke himself was severely wounded by return fire, and barely managed to land his damaged fighter, spending the rest of the war in hospitals. Japanese Naval Aviation Lieutenant Sadatoshi Miyazaki of the 302nd Kokutai, tasked with developing night fighter tactics against B-29s, concluded that the only viable approach was to avoid the bomber's defensive armament entirely by attacking in darkness when the remote-controlled turrets were less effective, but even these tactics achieved limited success as American bombers shifted to low-level night incendiary raids that negated Japanese altitude performance advantages while maintaining their defensive firepower superiority. The final chapter in the Chin turret story came in the closing months of the European War, when some B-17 groups actually removed their Chin turrets to improve performance and range, recognizing that with the Luftwaffe essentially destroyed as an effective force, the weight and drag of defensive armament was no longer justified, a remarkable reversal from the desperate days of 1943 when bomber crews would have given anything for additional defensive firepower, and a testament to how completely the Chin turret had helped shift the balance of the air war. German fighter ace Major Gunther Rall, who survived the war with 275 aerial victories, later reflected that the Chin turret represented a fundamental shift in aerial warfare, the moment when technology began to override pilot skill as the determining factor in combat, stating that no amount of courage or experience could overcome the mathematical certainty of flying into concentrated defensive fire from multiple Chin turrets. It was simple physics, and physics always wins, a philosophical observation that captured the transition from the romantic age of aerial combat to the industrial age of aerial warfare. The legacy of the Chin turret extended beyond World War II, influencing post-war bomber design and defensive armament concepts, with the Soviet Union carefully studying captured B-17GS and incorporating similar defensive systems in their Tupolev Tu-4 copy of the B-29, while the British and Americans continued to develop powered defensive turrets for early jet bombers before guided missiles eventually made gun armament obsolete. But for a crucial period in 1943 to 1945, the Bendix Chin turret had proven that a relatively simple technological innovation could completely negate an enemy's most effective tactic. In the final analysis, the Chin turret represented everything that gave the Allies their ultimate victory: industrial capacity to mass-produce technical solutions, flexibility to rapidly adapt to enemy tactics, and the engineering expertise to create effective countermeasures, while the Axis powers, despite tactical brilliance and individual courage, could not match this combination of resources and innovation, leaving German pilots like Hans Knoke to face the bitter reality that February day in 1944, watching his carefully planned frontal attack disintegrate in the face of streaming tracers from Chin turrets, knowing that everything had changed, that the tactics that had brought the Luftwaffe such success were now obsolete, rendered useless by 250 caliber machine guns in a powered turret that cost less than a motorcycle but had ended Germany's best hope of stopping the American bomber offensive that would ultimately contribute to the Third Reich's destruction.